Hi everybody, welcome back. Glad you could tune in again. So a few months ago, one of my friends at All Saints, one of you guys, asked me whether I'd be willing to provide some input, teaching and advice and so on the subject of evangelism. And I thought about it at the time, and I thought about it a little while since then, and I think maybe it would be helpful to do something on that subject at some point, maybe in these devotions or at some other point in the future. But before I do that, I want to address something which typically arises as a concern whenever this subject is broached in our circles. When people hear a minister or somebody talking about evangelism, one or two fears start to arise in one or two minds, and I want to just allay one of those fears today. The fear I have in mind is that the evangelistic energy that a church seeks to deploy in its life and in its worship will inevitably result in a seeker-sensitive, quote-unquote, approach to worship. I think you probably know what I mean by that, but let me just spell it out in a bit more detail. The thinking in some circles goes a little bit like this, that if you want to make your church welcoming to people who are not from a churched background, people from the world, so to speak, people who are not used to worshipping, what you need to do is to turn church into something that they are more familiar with. We shape our church's liturgy so that it looks a little bit more like the world, so that people from the world are more comfortable in church. I've seen this done in all kinds of different ways. I've seen here in London cafe churches. I've seen what I can only describe as chat show churches. I've seen all kinds of gimmickry imported into churches' life and worship from the modern entertainment industry and elsewhere in an attempt to make people who aren't Christians feel comfortable. And I want to reassure you that anything you hear from me, and I suspect, very strongly suspect, in fact I know for a fact, from Pastor Neil or anybody else who speaks and teaches at All Saints, now or in the future, when anybody is encouraging us to be evangelistically engaged, will not entail the embrace of that kind of seeker-sensitive worship. There are obvious biblical and theological reasons for this, aren't there? And I'm not going to go into all of those in great detail now. Maybe we could talk about them in the future if you'd like me to dot the I's and cross the T's. But there are plenty of biblical and theological reasons why our worship should be shaped in particular ways that aren't dictated by the secular world around us. But I do want to address the reason why some people advocate that form of worship, and really it's a set of pragmatic reasons. They claim that it just works, and they point to many examples of large churches in the US and elsewhere where it seems to have worked to restyle or reshape the worship of those congregations so that people feel comfortable when they're not used to coming into worship and they're not used to the sorts of things Christians do. You take away those distinctive things and suddenly all the unbelievers feel comfortable. I want to challenge that pragmatic assumption. And I adduce in my defence a good friend of mine here in London. He's a minister of a church down in Canada Water. And the church is very evangelistically effective. It's not huge, it's 100 or so people, but it wasn't 100 or so people a few years ago. And in order to illustrate what's wrong with the pragmatic assumptions of the seeker-sensitive movement, I need to tell you a little bit about Canada Water and a little bit about this church. Canada Water first. You may or may not know that Canada Water is right in the heart of the financial district in London. It's an extremely wealthy place. The few people who can afford to live there are living in these extremely expensive tower block apartments where they're paying thousands and thousands of pounds rent a month for a tiny little flat, and they're working in the banks and other financial institutions nearby in these huge skyscrapers that you'll see. If you ever fly to London, you fly past them on the flight path into Heathrow Airport. It's an extremely wealthy place, and the congregation at Canada Water, that has grown over the years, is mainly people in their 20s, young, trendy, wealthy, well-heeled people, mostly, who are exactly the kind of people who you might expect would bring with them a certain set of expectations from their secular, cultural and entertainment experiences and would expect the church to conform. You might expect that Canada Water Church is one place where you would definitely expect to see seeker-sensitive worship being effective. And if you go to the worship at Canada Water Church, you find nothing of the kind. You find worship which is very, very similar to how we pattern our worship up here in North London at Emmanuel, very similar to All Saints. It's traditional, it's conservative in the sense that it's seeking to conserve biblical traditions, biblical patterns of worship, the posture, the Lord's Supper every week, and so on and so forth, the kinds of elements of worship that characterise and have characterised Christian worship throughout the ages. And yet, people have been coming in quite considerable numbers to this church. And I was talking with Kruger about the sorts of approaches that they've employed to try and welcome people, because of course rejecting the idea of being seeker sensitive doesn't mean that we're seeker unfriendly. We can still be friendly to people even though we're not trying to restyle our liturgy to fit with the entertainment industry. But I've been talking to Kruger, the pastor, about what kinds of things he'd been doing, and it suddenly occurred to me in the middle of our conversation, the reason why the approach that they've adopted of remaining conservative and traditional, why, pragmatically speaking, it seems to have been so effective. The truth is that people who've discovered or rediscovered faith in Christ at Canada Water Church are used to progressivism everywhere. They're used to every institution they're a part of, everywhere they go, almost everybody they meet, constantly shape-shifting and chasing to keep up with the latest cultural fad, the latest cultural trend. They've got the diversity seminars at work. They've got all the trendy signs embracing the latest craziness from various cultural movements all over the public transport system and so on and so forth. Everybody is chasing to keep ahead of the curve. And when everybody is doing that, it is no longer radical to be a radical. It is no longer progressive to be progressive. If everybody is progressive, then actually conservatism is the new radicalism. To find an institution that says, you know what we do here is what our forefathers in the faith have been doing for 2,000 years, best we can tell. We're just going to stick with this, is actually curiously attractive to precisely those people who aren't Christians, who have everywhere else been led to believe that the best way to stay ahead of the curve is by changing the whole time. If you find somebody or an institution like this church that just says, here we stand, we can do no other, so to speak, that's actually curiously attractive. Kruger described it as that it's almost as though the church has a slightly underground feel to it, a slightly retro feel to it, that even for people who aren't Christians, in God's providence is curiously attractive. And of course, by God's grace, as they actually experience the combination of what is actually a very friendly congregation. I know some of the people in it, they're very friendly folks. They experience the combination of that with the traditional Christian worship that they're invited to participate in if they would like to. That has been the tool in God's providence which has led to some wonderful growth in that church. So let me reassure you, anything that I do say about evangelism now or in the future will not be a prelude to any suggestion, God forbid, that we should in any way seek to tweak or alter the principled elements of our worship in order to fit in with the culture. We don't do that with anything else. Why on earth would we do it with that which is most precious? What we do when we gather together in the presence of the living God. The Lord bless you, and I hope very much to see you soon. Bye for now.